I think we're in a phase of irrational exuberance. This train wreck was on the tracks, and the reason we knew it was on the tracks is that for 2.5 years, almost 3 years, the money supply, the stock of money, is basically not growing. So that's the slowdown recession end of the thing. To be highly skeptical of any kind of government data, and be highly skeptical of anything that comes out of Washington, D.C.
There has been a fury of economic controversy that came out last week, which we'll be discussing today. First, the Federal Reserve kept rates unchanged, even when many economists argue that they should have lowered rates. In fact, at the FOMC meeting, there were 2 dissenters. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about what happened with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The BLS Commissioner Erica McAntifer was fired last Friday after the biggest jobs revision, the downward revision that we saw on Friday, the biggest one in 50 years, was released. Trump fired the BLS commissioner, calling the data rigged. We'll discuss that. And finally, whether or not we're in an asset price bubble, and where money comes from, and how this bubble was created. These are big themes we'll be discussing with our next expert, Steve Hanke, professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University, an expert in all of these subjects. Welcome back to the show, Professor. It's always good to have you.
Good to see you, David.
Before we get to the economic...
On this beautiful Saturday morning in Baltimore, I don't know, how is it in Vancouver?
Well, you can see from behind me, the background is somewhat sunny. But the weather is as volatile as the markets here, so who knows? It might be raining in an hour. I don't know. Yeah. But I appreciate you joining us today on this fine Saturday morning. I want to start by talking about money creation and money supply. I'll play for you a few clips from Tucker Carlson's recent interview with Professor Richard Werner. This is very interesting, and I think you'll have some interesting reactions. Take a listen, and we'll react together.
So when it did the empirical test, the conclusion was the financial intermediation theory is rejected and the fractional reserve theory is rejected. Banks create money out of nothing. By the way, you can look it up. It's the most downloaded paper of all Elsevier publications and it's open access. So can banks individually create money out of nothing?
Any bank. Just to be clear, not just central banks.
Any bank. In fact, that's the whole point. We're talking about normal banks. With central banks, it wouldn't be a surprise.
But the Bank of Omaha can
any bank creates money. When you take out a loan, the money that you're given as the borrower didn't previously exist. It is net new purchasing power that is being created and added to the money supply. And that's how the system works. Now, to understand how the system works is a precondition for having good economic analysis and good policy recommendations. And that explains for over 100 years, macroeconomics has made no progress. They have no banks in there. They have no bank credit creation in there. You know, when the 2008 crisis happened, and the journalists, and I'm sure yourself also, want to ask some experts. Let's go to MIT professor of economics. What's going on? Lehman Brothers gone bust. Banks are going bust. Bank of America in trouble. What's happening? The honest answer of all the professors of economics would have been, well, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question.
Can banks create money out of thin air? And if so, can we see a surge in the money supply if they choose to do so this year? Anyway, I'll let you answer those 2 parts of the question.
Well, Professor Werner is correct. The old school and the correct school is that banks create deposit money out of thin air. They used to actually call this pen money because they would make you a loan and they would write the information with a pen. The loan and the receipt would all be written in ink with a pen, and they called it pen money. It's created out of thin air. Now, most of and by the way, Matt Sakurki and I have written a book that explains all of this in a book length analysis. The book's called Making Money Work. It was published by Wiley and issued on May 6th. So it's all in great detail for anyone who actually wants to understand how banks work, how the money supply works, how monetary policy works. You've got to go to Sakurki and Hanke to find it in some detail. But the proposition that Werner makes with Tucker Carlson is in fact correct. It is the old school and the correct school. Money is created out of thin air in a fiat system, that is. The system we exist in now is a fiat money system, and that is how it's done. Banks don't intermediate savings. Deposit-taking banks, most people think that you save money and it goes into a commercial bank, and the commercial bank intermediates that money. They place your savings in some sort of investment by making a loan to somebody who's borrowing money from them. No, investment banks intermediate savings, not deposit-taking banks, but banks that are referred to as investment banks. That's who intermediates savings. And they don't create money, by the way. It's deposit-making banks that create money. Now, if for most of your viewers, if they've studied economics, they've all been brought up with the wrong theory of how banks create money. And they think that it's by taking deposits. The deposits are the source.
Well, so let me just ask you to clarify here, because this is what we studied in school. Okay, so the money multiplier formula, you have broad money M3 over the reserve ratio, or sorry, reserve money rather, M0, or you have 1 over the reserve ratio, which is the amount of money that's held in excess. Higher the value of money multiplier, higher will be the liquidity in the market, and vice versa. Deposits, the higher the reserve ratio is, the less deposits will be available for lending. Anyway, is this correct?
No, it's all wrong.
This is in our Econ 101 textbooks.
This. All the textbooks basically are wrong. What Werner writes is correct. What Sakurki and I write, and by the way, we cite the work that Werner has done. Also, there is another very good working paper by the Bank of England that describes this. But if you want it quickly, you just buy our book, and it's all in there. Now, the idea, by the way, behind this, working out your formula, by the way, put that thing back up on the screen,
yeah,
David.
Sure. Okay.
So how this works, let's say that the money multiplier, you have $100 in deposits, and if you do, that will expand with a 5% reserve ratio. Dividing 5% into 100, you get 2,000. So that's how the money multiplier works in terms of its arithmetic. In terms of its kind of the logical argument, cash is deposited and it's loaned to another customer, and the amount of the loans is whatever the cash deposit was minus the reserve requirement. And those loans, those new loans, are deposited by the recipient of the loan. And those deposits are loaned out up to the maximum amount of whatever the reserve ratio is. And so that daisy chain just keeps going until the end, and you end up with what I just gave you in the example. You initially deposit 100. If the number for the reserve requirement is 5%, you end up at the end of the daisy chain by creating $2,000. Now, this is all wrong. And the easiest way to understand this, in 2020, there were de minimis reserve requirements in the United States, but in 2020, they were completely eliminated. So what happens if you put the number 0 in as a reserve requirement in that formula? Well, yeah. You have an infinite expansion of the money supply.
Right.
So this demonstrates that the whole thing is just absolute nonsense. Banks don't intermediate savings. Investment banks do. and other financial institutions do. But deposit-taking banks create money out of thin air in a fiat money system, which is a point that, of course, Werner was trying to make in his interview with Tucker Carlson. There are also legal differences between liabilities created by deposit-taking banks, and their liabilities are what? They're the deposits, and the deposits are exchanged and redeemable at par. But that's not the case with savings that are taken in by investment banks and loaned out. The prices vary on the debt, which is a liability of an investment bank, or the equity created by an investment bank. Those are the liabilities. The liability side, the asset comes into a investment bank, and the investment bank, those are somebody's savings that are coming in. That's the asset of the investment bank, and the liabilities are either debt or equity, and those prices vary. They're not redeemable at par like a deposit. So there's just a world of difference between intermediating savings that people have through financial institutions and the creation of money by deposit-taking banks. Those are really created out of thin air.
Before we continue with the video, let me tell you about a very serious threat that you're facing every day that you may not even be aware of. Most people have no idea how much of their personal information is floating around on the internet. Your address, phone number, and email can be found and sold by data brokers without you even knowing. That's why I use today's sponsor, Delete Me. It scans data broker sites for your personal information and removes it. And it doesn't stop there. It keeps checking and clearing new listings throughout the year. Once you sign up, you'll get a privacy report within a week showing you exactly where your data was found and what's been taken down. It's a straightforward way to protect your privacy without having to chase every site yourself. Go to joindeleteme.com/DavidLin and use promo code DavidLin at checkout, or scan the QR code on screen right here to get 20% off all US plans. Take control of your personal data before somebody else does.
I was just going to reference your book here and kind of go into a bit more detail and explain here. Over the course of this book, we will justify this claim and refute the standard textbook stories. You were just doing that. You said, well, you wrote here, banks create deposit funding out of nothing. Banks create money when they make new loans. Deposit money is credited to a borrower on the books of the bank against the recognition of a loan asset. The deposit money created by the loan remains in circulation until the principal of the loan is repaid. Okay, so what mechanically happens when a bank issues a new loan? What's on their books here?
Well, they issue what we call in our book. They discover what are, number one, investable projects, what are potentially projects that would qualify in principle for a loan, and then they scrub it down, and you get a bankable project. And a bankable project is something a bank is willing to make a loan on, and that bankable project usually puts up collateral for the loan to receive the loan, and the bank creates credit out of nothing, and the credit goes into the bank account of the loan recipient. And that deposit is money. It qualifies as part of the money supply. In the United States, of course, it would be part of the broadest money measure would be M2, so it would be part of M2, and the money supply expands. And that's why I've gone over with you in the past. The importance of commercial banks is that they are the elephant in the room in a fiat money system, because they're producing and creating most of the money. It's not created by the central bank. most of the money is created out of thin air by commercial banks. And in the United States, almost 80%, David, of the money supply, the stock of the money supply, M2, has been created by commercial banks out of thin air. Now, you asked your question before. You said, oh, does this mean if they can create money out of thin air that we're going to have an explosion in the money supply? No, because there are all kinds of regulations on banks, for example, and banks are prudent. They're not going to. There aren't that many bankable projects. They're not going to just loan nilly-willy to everything under the sun. Now, in some underdeveloped countries, they do, by the way, because of lack of regulation or mandates by the government to loan to the government. What usually happens when you have a hyperinflation? The government runs a deficit, and the commercial banks are faced with a situation where the central banker or the fiscal authorities, they come in, the fiscal authorities come into the central bank and the commercial banks with a revolver, and they say, oh, we just have some great treasury paper we want to sell you. And the bankers, whether they're the central bank or the commercial bank, say, oh, yes, we agree. This just looks great. We're buying it. And we create what? Credit. And when they create the credit, the money supply does start exploding. And you end up with hyperinflation, an inflation rate of over 50% per month.
So in theory, let's say if the reserve ratio, which is the fraction of a bank's deposits that needs to be held in reserve, if the reserve ratio is close to zero, back to the money multiplier formula, just theoretically speaking, I mean, what would happen to the money supply? Let's say the bank continues.
It's all wrong. It's all wrong. You've got it wrong. It's clear you've learned your lesson and you've learned it wrong. Forget the money multiplier. It's irrelevant.
Okay.
And the proof I gave you. By the way, we can get out in the technical weeds, which we are not going to do on a program like this. But you're not peddling a podcast to super PhD students.
Well, maybe there's some PhDs watching. Who knows? I don't know.
But let's just demonstrate the fact that the money multiplier is nonsense. Since 2022, there is no reserve requirement placed on banks. So why hasn't the money supply exploded to infinity? It hasn't exploded. In fact, the money created by banks now is only growing at about 4.5% per year. That's even below Hanke's golden growth rate, a rate consistent with hitting the inflation target of 2% in the United States. That golden growth rate is 6.3%. 4.5, interestingly enough, the broad money being created in the United States is growing at 4.5% per year, and the contribution being made by commercial banks happens to be growing at 4.5%. Why are those numbers exactly the same, or why are they pretty close to the same all the time? Because the elephant in the room are commercial banks. That's who produces most of the money. Most people think central banks create the money. They don't. They're minor players in the grand scheme of things.
So where does the bank get the money for the loans that they make? If, let's say, the loans that they issue are greater than the deposits they have in their books.
Because you just have the whole thing wrong. You just don't understand anything. They get it out of thin air.
Yeah, but
they don't intermediate savings that come in and are deposited in the bank. That the deposits are not the source of loans. Thin air is a source.
But okay, maybe explain to the layman watching.
That's the point. That's the point Werner was trying to make.
Right, but okay, but they write these loans. It has to, for accounting purposes, be sourced from somewhere. You can't. I mean, thin air is not a line item on the balance sheet, Professor. How does it work?
That's how it works. Thin air.
Okay, all right. Okay, so are you concerned about the financial system then breaking if, let's say, thin air is a source of so many of these loan originations?
That's how the fiat system, in a fiat system, we're not on a gold standard or a commodity standard as historically we always had some connection to that. We're in a fiat system, and this is how the fiat system works.
All right.
It doesn't work. It does not work with money multiplier. It is not a system in which deposit-taking banks intermediate savings. Savings don't go through the commercial banks, the deposit-taking. Banks are in the United States are universal banks now, and they have a deposit-taking section, and they also have an investment bank section. And there are separate investment banks, like you mentioned Lehman Brothers, or Werner mentioned Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers wasn't a deposit-taking bank; it was an investment bank. Bear Stearns was not a commercial bank and not a deposit-taking bank. It was an investment bank. They were intermediating savings. They weren't creating money.
Okay, on that note, this is what Ray Dalio said on Twitter, or X now. The U.S. dollar used to be backed by gold, and it's not far-fetched to think we may be headed there again in the future. History shows us that the same cycles repeat over and over again. Governments print a lot of money. They pay off the debt with cheap money. Nobody wants to hold the devalued currency. And then finally, governments go back and link money to gold. Will this same pattern happen again? It's hard to say, and it wouldn't happen anytime soon, but it is conceivable, he says. What do you think?
Well, I agree with Dalio, and to put it into context, is the following. Bob Mundell, one of my old mentors, Nobel laureate in economics, one of the founder of the euro, and a great scholar and student of monetary systems. Mundell always said, he made a statement. And the statement went something like this: well, we're not on the gold standard, either a pure gold standard since 1971 when the gold window was shut in the United States, or the system doesn't have any direct connection to gold. But he said, you just can't get gold out of the financial system. It's been around for thousands of years, and He anticipated that it would come back, like Dalio. He anticipated that it would come back in the system more directly, not de facto. De facto, it's still around, and gold is still an important currency. De jure, it's been out officially really since 1971.
Okay,
so
I want to.
So yes. What Dalio is saying, to summarize it in a different way, it's kind of similar to what Mundell was saying. Mundell said, well, we had gold or some commodity standard de jure for thousands of years, and then that was cut off in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window. But Mundell said, de facto, gold is still a part of the system. And that's essentially an interpretation of what Dalio said. Now, to show you how important it is, remember what happened to gold yesterday? Did you follow what happened to gold yesterday?
Yeah, it would reach a new all-time high because bullions being imported were apparently tariffed. But
right, it looked like the bullion coming into the U.S. would be placed under Trump's tariff madness. And the price spiked as a result of that. And almost immediately they exempted bullion imports from Trump's tariff madness. That happened almost instantly. And why did that happen? It happened because de facto, gold is still a very important part of the international financial system. And if they would have left that tariff madness in place and not exempted, who knows how the system would have spun out of control.
Well, ultimately, then, I want to play for you one more clip from the Werner interview. This leads to the ultimate point of why we're talking about fractional reserve banking, and he's talking about how this creates asset bubbles. Let's take a listen, and we'll link it to today's the current macroeconomic condition here.
But the regular banking crises are mainly when banks create credit for asset purchases, and that's what creates these boom-bust cycles. In the UK, bank credit, 85% of bank credit is for asset purchases. And so you get these asset boom-bust cycles, banking crises in regular intervals. In some other countries, I haven't mentioned the third scenario now. So bank credit for asset purchases, no good. It's not sustainable. It's not productive. Credit creation for consumption it's for the real economy, but it's for consumption. Therefore, it's inflationary. It's also no good. It's not sustainable. The third possibility is the redeeming feature of banking. And that's why we can turn banking into a very positive, very powerful positive force for creating prosperity and abundance. Namely, when banks create credit for productive business investment, for the investment in the production of goods and services, implementing new technologies, implementing new ideas.
Does a bank actually determine where the money goes? I mean, if you lend money for a bankable project, like you just mentioned earlier in the interview, right? It's not, I'm the entrepreneur here. I can decide if I want to go buy assets, Bitcoin, or I can go and start a productive business. It's not the bank's problem. It's the entrepreneur's problem. But I'll let you respond to that.
No, it's a bank's problem because they decide what's a bankable project. And what is a bankable project? From a bank's point of view, it's a project that will generate a surplus that will allow the recipient of the loan to amortize the loan and pay interest on the loan and discharge the debt at the end of the day. And of course, when the debt is discharged, that aspect, it is, as we point out, you quoted in our book, that reduces the money supply.
You've called
Werner's mixing up kind of three things in here, and one thing that he's leaning heavily on are prudent bankable projects, and we talk about that and develop it in the book, Making Money Work. All of this is laid out in excruciating detail with hundreds of references, footnotes, et cetera, and Sakurki and Hanke, Making Money Work. Well, it's interesting. Werner has written a couple of papers on this that are good, and nothing wrong with them. We've written a whole book on it, and the one of the aspects of the book revolves around the creation of money in the bankable projects and the fact that bank regulation, and this is the key, one of the keys and new contribution in our book, and that is monetary policy. One important aspect of monetary policy are the regulations that surround banking, or the rules of the game that surround banking. This is very important. For example, let me give you one concrete thing. So we can let's get down to where the rubber meets the road now, David. And that is the supplementary liquidity reserve requirement that's been placed on banks ever since the great financial crisis in 2008. Well, that constrains banks and reduces their capacity to make loans to bankable projects. And that's one reason, by the way, that loan growth, I said, is at 4.5%. It's been very slow, by the way. Banks have been very constrained since the great financial crisis. And we indicate in our book that, among other things, the supplemental liquidity requirement should be deep six. And the Fed now and the current administration of Trump are talking about getting rid of that. And when they do, the banks will have more capacity to make more prudent loans into what Werner's talking about, he's talking about bankable projects. That was the third thing he talked about.
Yes.
Third thing,
productive uses of capital into bankable projects. But do you think, back to the first thing he talked about, bank credit creation for the purpose of asset purchases, which leads to asset bubbles? Are we in currently an asset bubble that's predicated by banks buying stuff? Yes.
We are in a bubble right now, according to Hanke's bubble detector, but it doesn't have anything really to do with banks. That part of his scenario, I really don't agree with.
Okay, so what led to this asset bubble?
We are in a bubble, and the bubble is driven by, I think, what I refer to as speculative frenzy, or what Professor Schiller titled his book. Remember his famous book, Irrational Exuberance. It's the animal spirits. It's what Keynes called the animal spirits, what Schiller called irrational exuberance, what Hanke calls a speculative frenzy. Why do you think something like Bitcoin just goes up, up, up? Bitcoin has no fundamental value. There's zero fundamental value. But that's not what the market price is. The market price just goes up and up. It's a speculative asset that has zero fundamental value. And I think it's symptomatic of the kind of speculative frenzy that we're in right now. The big problem is I can measure the speculative bubble. Schiller has a way to measure it. Robert Schiller, Nobel laureate, Yale University, first-rate economist, author of The Irrational Exuberance. He thinks we're in a bubble now. We can all measure it. The problem is we can't predict how we're going to reach more reasonable valuation levels in the market and get rid of the bubble. Will the bubble pop and we reach them very rapidly? Or will the air just slowly seep out of the bubble and it'll take years before we reach some kind of equilibrium of shall we say, prudent and normal, regular valuations, and the bubble disappears. We don't know. We don't know, and we can't predict.
How do you know we're in a bubble? I mean, what's in the Hanke bubble indicator?
The bubble indicator is relative to the income flows coming out of assets. The assets are priced at very excessive levels. In simple terms, without getting into the formula, you can look at the formula. By the way, I did write an article with Caleb Hoffman in Fortune magazine, which we go through this. If you want to get into the weeds of how you calculate it and so forth, but the idea is that the flow of returns being generated by an asset are excessive relative to its valuation.
This is the global M2 chart. There's a theory out there, just going back to your Bitcoin statement, there's a theory out there that Bitcoin's price is somewhat correlated to the change of global M2, not just US M2. If you can see that it's somewhat correlated here, Bitcoin and other risk assets troughed around 2022, and it's been rising ever since. I wonder if this is actually, people have started using this as a predictive indicator for where asset prices are going to go. I mean, what do you think?
Well, fools always engage in correlations. Correlations exist, but they don't necessarily imply causation. To have a predictive model, you have to have some model of causation. And the correlation tells you nothing about causation.
So you don't think Bitcoin and other speculative assets are going up because of global M2 returning? It's not, people aren't injecting liquidity into speculative assets if liquidity goes up.
I think we're in a phase of irrational exuberance.
Okay. One more question, and I want to turn to the current jobs report and then close off. What usually causes exuberance in an economic cycle? Is it the monetary policies dictated by the Fed?
I think Schiller, going back to Bob Schiller. Schiller has another. In a way, he's done a lot of work, technical work, very high quality. The Schiller case index for real estate prices. That's a very technical thing. Schiller did that. But he became famous in a way to the broad public. I mean, with his book Irrational Exuberance, because Alan Greenspan was chairman of the Fed then, and Greenspan latched onto the thing, and basically helped make Schiller kind of, shall we say, a household word. Now, beyond that, and this gets back to answering your question, and that's the irrational, the speculative frenzy and irrational exuberance. He wrote a book, Schiller, on narrative economics. That's one of his most recent books. You can check that out. And the narrative economics goes back into the irrational exuberance thing, and it goes back into Keynes's animal spirits thing. And that is, you get a narrative out there, and the narrative catches on. And the narratives, of course, can, many times don't hold any water whatsoever, but they're a narrative, and they keep getting repeated over and over by everybody. And pretty soon the narrative becomes reality. And Bitcoin is one of those narratives. And the narrative goes something like this. Well, there's a limited supply of Bitcoin. The supply is infinitely inelastic. Limited supply. And therefore, it must go up.
I reckon you'll be getting some letters for this interview. If you have any thoughts of what Professor Hanke just said, write him down below. Anyway.
Okay. Well, before the BS artists start writing nasty comments, they should read Schiller's book, Irrational Exuberance. And then after they read that book, they can read narrative economics, and they'll find out why Bitcoin is just a lot of gas.
Okay, we'll come back to that another time. We've talked about this before. I want to move on to the recent jobs report. So the economy added 73,000 jobs in July. Here's a chart showing what happened here. May and June were revised significantly downward. This is the biggest downward revision in the last 50 years. The commissioner of the BLS was let go by President Trump. Before we talk about the jobs market itself, what's your response to the firing? Trump claimed that the numbers were faked. He used the word faked. That's his reason for firing her.
Number one, the thing that was fake was what came out of the mouth of the President of the United States.
Okay.
Now, I was obviously opposed to the firing of the
commissioner.
BLM
Yes,
commissioner. They use a standard procedure. It's not they're not over there manipulating stuff around. The problem, if you wanted to let a BLS commissioner go, they could have let a lot of them go over the years, because the quality of what they've been producing is going down. Now, one reason for that, however, has nothing to do with the commissioner or the BLS. They do these surveys, and And in a survey, the person answering the questions they don't have a gun at their head. They're not filling out a survey under duress or anything like that.
Yes.
They're voluntarily doing it, but they basically stopped doing it. It's like this. It's like the consumer price index. We have the same problem with the consumer price index. People are not filling out these surveys. So the quality of the data go down, and because in the consumer price index, for example, about 30% of the prices, they're just guesstimates by the bureaucrats in Washington. Now, they have statistical tests to do this and so forth, but that's why all the revisions are getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time, because the quality of the data they're receiving is becoming lower and lower quality. And the reason for that is that the response rate has been going down.
Well, so maybe Trump should make it mandatory to fill this out. Maybe it should be part of the Census Bureau's job to, mandate this. I don't know. Just throwing that out there.
I don't want to get into that.
Oh, okay. Well, what's the solution then, Professor? How would you design this if you were the commissioner of the BLS and Trump says to you, well, we just let go of the last person. We want you to do a better job.
Fortunately, that's not my job.
Okay.
Fair
enough.
And it's something I'm not going to pontificate about, but I will. I'm turning to my bookshelf here in back of me.
Yes.
And this is not new. I'm holding up a book here on the accuracy of economic observations by Oscar Morgenstern. He with von Neumann was one of the co-inventors of game theory. Their book invented game theory. This book that Morgenstern wrote, the first edition of the book was by the way, it's published by Princeton University Press. The first edition was actually back in 1965. No, sorry. I stand corrected. 1950, actually, 1950. So this book goes through in detail all the problems associated with government data. So this is something, it's not new. It's been getting worse, but it's not new.
Okay, so should we, as citizens of, this republic, trust government data anymore to make informed decisions?
No, you should be like Hanke. I require this book of my students. And you saw, I'm at my home study right now where I have my important library. And that's one of the important books. I think every week I look at Morgenstern and require my students to learn it. Unfortunately, a lot of it doesn't soak in. And the students aren't as skeptical as their professor. What you should be is like what's rubbed off from Morgenstern on me is to be highly skeptical of any kind of government data and be highly skeptical of anything that comes out of Washington, D.C. Let me give you a story.
Yeah.
That illustrates this. One of my mentors was Bill Niskanen. He was one of McNamara's whiz kids. He saw all the secret, and he had the highest clearance. He had the rank. He was 27 years old when he had the civil service equivalent rank of a brigadier general. So the guy was up on top of things. When they went to the moon, what did Niskanen think? Niskanen thought that it was fake. He thought they were staging this thing in a warehouse someplace in Washington, D.C. That's what a skeptic has in mind when they hear anything coming out of a capital, any place in the world, including Washington, D.C., or any data coming out. So that's my view.
Okay, so let's just take the data at face value. Several reports are indicating that the weaker jobs revision may give the Federal Reserve some ammunition to lower rates at the next meeting in September. Do you agree?
Well, first of all, I think the jobs data confirms what Hanke's been looking under the hood, saying on David Lynn's show for months, and that is the economy is going to slow down because the money supply has been growing at a very slow and anemic rate. And when that happens, we have a slowdown in the economy and in some cases even get a recession. So I think we're at kind of a tipping point, and this data confirms that tipping point that we're on the verge of going into recession. Even Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's, says we're on the verge of going into recession. They're all coming around to Hanke's point of view, which, any intelligent person, they could have tuned in on David Lynn's show a long time ago and seen this coming. You could have seen this coming by watching David Lynn's show months ago and listening to Hanke's interviews. This train wreck was on the tracks, and the reason we knew it was on the tracks is that for 2.5 years, almost 3 years, the money supply, the stock of money, is basically not growing. So that's the slowdown recession end of the thing. The data happened to confirm what I think has been in the cards for quite some time. Now, whether it will be revised again up or down, I have no clue.
2 governors dissented against the last FOMC decision. Both of them, actually, including Waller, are considered runners-up to replace Powell. So who's got it right?
You're right. So that now you ask about the interest rate, which that's the second part of the story. The first part of the story is that the money supply dominates, and the slowdown in the money supply means slowdown in the economy. Then you ask, well, what about interest rates? What would you do about interest rates, Hanke? And Hanke doesn't pay that much attention to interest rates because monetary policy is not about interest rates. It's about changes in the money supply. And the money supply is growing at only 4.5% per year. To hit the inflation target at 2% at the Fed, it should be growing at about 6% per year, Hanke's golden growth rate. So how would you get that up? 2 things. One, you should get rid of this supplementary reserve requirement that are being placed on banks. And I think they're going to do that, which is a good thing. So that'll give the banks more capacity to make more loans to bankable projects and increase the money supply. That's a good thing.
Please continue.
The second thing is the Fed itself. They should stop quantitative tightening. They're shrinking the balance sheet. They're quantitative tightening. They should remove that requirement. So those are the 2 things I'd be focused on, not interest rates. In interest rates, for example, let's look at the interest rate focus on Japan. Japan has had interest rates at very low levels, almost zero for 25, 30 years. The money supply has not grown. That's been growing at a very anemic rate for 25 or 30 years in Japan.
Yes.
So again, the interest rates don't run the show. What runs the show are policies that affect the growth rate and the money supply, not interest rates, not the Fed funds rate. People are looking at the wrong thing because they don't understand monetary economics. It's going back to what we were talking about, creating money out of thin air. They've all been brought up on this fractional reserve nonsense, and the formula that you put up on the nonsensical formula that you put up earlier. It doesn't work that way.
There's a lot of things that they put in the textbooks that you don't agree with. That's one of them. The Phillips curve we talked about is another thing that's been, front page of Econ 101 textbooks around the world. We had to read several of these books, and they're all quoting the same theories. But anyway, that's a separate discussion on the state of education.
I can pitch my book. They should buy it.
Well, yeah, they should probably, yeah. We'll get that on the dean's lists around the world. I want to just final question, Professor, before we go. This is an interesting development. Kugler, Fed Governor Kugler, has resigned, and President Trump has replaced her with an interim governor, Stephen Miran. He said that I think we have to acknowledge the president has had an absolutely fabulous track record on the subject of interest rates. He's going to end up having been proven right again that lower rates are appropriate. He also supposedly he co-authored a Manhattan Institute report last year that called the Fed's independence as an outdated shibboleth, and he called for shorter terms for governors. So Trump replaced the outgoing governor, or one of the outgoing governors, with somebody who agrees with him on lower rates and agrees with the idea of having more intervention by the White House on Fed policy. What is the future of Fed independence then, is my question.
Well, the Fed is, this is fiction that the Fed is independent. It's not independent. It is on paper, but in reality, it's not. So let's get rid of that problem. I wrote an article about this in Forbes magazine a number of years ago, and so that's the first point. The second point, the more important point, is the fact that Marin is focusing on interest rates, and so is Powell. And so is Trump, and they're all wrong. They all would receive an F from Hanke, because monetary policy is not about interest rates. It's about changes in the money supply. He's just got it all wrong. All the governors, by the way, are exactly like Marin, and they're exactly like Trump. The only thing they're quibbling about is where you set the Fed funds rate. They're never talking about the rate of growth in the money supply. So they're never talking about the only thing that counts in monetary policy. It's the money supply. You can read that also in a book I might mention, and that's Making Money Work by Matt Sikorski and Steve Hanke.
All right. On that note, where can we find your book, and where can we learn from you?
It's all over the planet. It's interplanetary. Just go to Amazon, go to Walmart, go to any online thing, and you can buy it.
All right, we'll put the link to.
And the good thing about it, actually, there's no such thing as a free lunch, but Wiley has prudently priced the thing at a reasonable price. So it's not going to bankrupt you by buying the darn thing.
I think if you're bankrupted by buying a book, you've got bigger problems than reading Hanke's book. But in any case, you should be reading it. Regardless of the price, I think excellent read. I've been quoting it in the last couple of interviews. But Professor, thank you very much for joining the program once more. And like I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to write emails to Professor Hanke and extol your comments about his Bitcoin commentary or anything else, write to him down below.
Don't send me your file, please. The email.
Please don't. Yes.
Hanke. Yeah. The trouble with Bitcoin is that those who embrace it, it's kind of become a secular religion. It doesn't have anything to do with that.
You're just giving people more fuel for the fire.
Well, it is. I'm just stating a few simple facts.
Okay.
Bitcoin has become a secular religion, and it has nothing to do with logic or thinking or economics or anything like that. So, and by the way, being a good free market economist, people should be free to speculate in it if they wish to do so.
Yes.
So at any rate, that's the email is hanke@jhu.edu. But the important thing for real-time information is they should follow me on X I've got about 806,000 followers now. I think it's rated as the third most influential economist on X. It's at Steve, the handle at Steve_Hanke.
Yes, we'll put the link down below and the email down below. Make sure to write Professor Hanke and give us some questions for the next interview. Thank you very much, Professor. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, great. Have a great weekend, David. Thank
you too. Thank you for joining us on this fabulous Saturday. We'll see you next time, and thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.